Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Philip Bump, and Sarah Westwood. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Philip is a national reporter for The Washington Post. And Sarah is a political and investigative reporter for The Washington Examiner. Welcome. It's good to have you all with us. Sarah, let me start with you. Top Democrats keep saying that they are close to an agreement on a framework for the spending and climate bill. Now, it's a moving target, but what are the main sticking points as of now?
There are still a number of sticking points outstanding, which would make any observer skeptical of the claim that they are close to a framework agreement. They've been repeating that on a loop for roughly a month now, but we're talking about some still pretty major points of contention in the negotiations, and that includes Medicare expansion, Medicaid expansion, exactly how much paid family leave they are going to put into that framework, how they're going to fund it. That is obviously probably the most significant thing that remains outstanding because of Senator Kyrsten Sinema's opposition to the array of tax hikes that the White House and the more progressive Democrats had laid out. Democrats are starting to have to get a little bit creative. And so they're reaching for, at the last minute, this new proposal that they're calling the billionaire tax on corporations that have more than $1 billion in profits. It's complicated. It's hard to sell to Democrats. It doesn't feel like the kind of win that just a straight corporate tax hike or just a straight tax on high-earning Americans might have felt for Democrats. So they are having a lot of trouble closing the deal here. And ultimately, one of the biggest problems is that public support for and interest in this bill is starting to flag the longer the negotiations drag on. And I don't think that Democrats have done a very good job of selling this piece of legislation and why it's necessary to Americans. A lot of Americans don't really know what this bill is about other than its price tag. It doesn't really have an identity beyond the fact that it's divided Democrats and that it will be expensive. And so now that Democrats are about to clinch a deal, they might have something more specific to take to the American people, but perceptions of the piece of legislation may already be baked. And that's part of why Democrats are having a hard time getting over the finish line.
It's interesting, Sarah, you mentioned that messaging. We're going to talk a little bit later in the show, in fact, to Joel Benenson, Democratic pollster, about that very point. In the meantime, though, Philip, where do progressives stand as some of the programs they wanted included in the spending plan are getting downsized or cut?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of frustration that there had been sort of this proposal from President Biden for this very big sweeping package of things that included a lot of expansions of programs that have been on the progressive and broadly the Democratic wish list for quite some time. And it really is obviously the case that because Senators Manchin and Sinema have been adamant about what price tag they want to see for this, which of course itself has elevated the issue of cost as a point of saliency in the national conversation, that a lot of those things have been either scaled back or potentially put on sort of a shortened time frame so that the cost isn't as big. Of course, there are also structural constraints because it's a reconciliation bill. You can't have an economic effect. You can't add to the deficit past a 10-year timeline by the nature of trying to pass this by avoiding the filibuster. So there are all these different constraints that are coming into play. It's a complicated package, and progressives are feeling frustrated. But I think the point that you just heard from Jen Psaki from the White House there is the point that Biden really wants to emphasize, which is that this is still better than nothing. And I think that's probably what the ultimate selling point will be, at least within Democratic legislators on the Hill.
Well, Ed, you asked White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about reaching a deal on climate spending before the president heads to Europe on Thursday. Let's listen to her response.
The president is on the verge. We are all on the verge of passing a bill that is the largest investment in addressing the climate crisis in history. And of course, global leaders take note of that, too.
All right. So, Ed, where do the climate portions of the president's spending plan stand after both progressives and Senator Manchin threaten to withhold support if they don't get what they want on climate?
Looks like it's still going to be a pretty substantial portion of this legislation. It's just a matter of how exactly money would be spent or what kind of policy would be implemented. But obviously, Manchin, coming from a coal-producing state, a state that still relies on fossil fuels to fuel its economy as well, is a factor in what exactly ends up being in this plan. Psaki had a great line. This is what Phil's referring to when she said that at this point, the White House is hopeful the Democrats won't let the perfect be the enemy of the historic. The idea being that when it comes to all these issues, whether it's paid family leave, big wholesale changes in the nation's climate change policy, funding for affordable housing or universal pre-kindergarten across the country, you're going from nothing to something. And that while you may not get exactly what was first proposed or what was promised during the campaign, to at least start providing something in those realms will be seen by this White House as a victory, and they're trying to convince congressional Democrats that for them, too, it can be a victory, especially because this president, as he apparently told Democrats who met with him earlier today, said, if it's not in there, or if not enough of it's in there, I'm going to spend the rest of my political life campaigning to ensure that those things are included, are implemented, or become permanent. So, I think that's kind of the point where this White House is. The jet fuel is supposed to be inserted into Air Force One by Thursday morning so he can take off for Europe. This town, Congress especially, likes the smell of jet fuel. It can inspire last-minute negotiations to suddenly bear fruit. And I think what they're hoping now is that by the time he prepares to take off Thursday morning, there's at least a handshake agreement that will allow these things to start moving. You've heard progressives today say an agreement isn't enough. We've got to see it written. We have to see the Senate voting on it in order to pass that infrastructure bill. But if the process can get started while he's in Europe, and if votes can be cast by the time he gets back next week, I think the White House would see that as a totally sufficient way to wrap this up and to find a way to move on.
All right. Well, Philip, against that backdrop, the Washington Post reports that Democrats are working to include an immigration provision in the spending bill framework. What might that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this is something that one way to look at the broader legislation here is that there are a lot of loose ends that Democrats are trying to sort of cobble together. And so one of the loose ends that's been outstanding since the Obama administration is what to do about people who entered the country without documentation who are now living and working in the United States. And so they are trying to incorporate that as well into this broader policy package. The challenge, again, is because this is a reconciliation bill, because it has to meet certain standards in order to actually be voted upon without having it be filibustered, it has to go before the Senate parliamentarian, and it has to be evaluated in a number of different ways to see whether or not it's going to have the sort of effects that are not allowed in the reconciliation bill. And so there's already been a proposal which has been put before the Senate parliamentarian and rejected that would essentially extend an existing law that allowed people who had who had entered the country without documentation prior to, I believe, the year was 1972. This is a law passed and signed by Ronald Reagan. That would sort of extend the timeline forward a bit. That, I believe, has already been rejected. So they're trying to figure out if there's a way that they can actually have this be implemented as part of this reconciliation package to provide at least some sense of security to people who are already living and working in the United States. But it seems like at this point in time, because the rules are so stringent here, that it's a tough road to hoe.
Well, Ed, Chairman and some members of the Congressional Black, Asian, Hispanic, Women's and Equality caucuses met with senior White House aides today. What was their message about the spending plan?
They came out, and the word of the recap, if you will, was unity. The idea that Democrats now understand they're on the verge of a big, they'll call it historic deal, and that while not everybody got what they wanted, they're about to do something pretty ambitious and, in their mind, historic. So this appeared to be designed in part to allow some of the most loyal caucuses and blocks of Democratic Party voters to get one last public airing of their concerns, their hopes, their dreams with the president and his top senior aides who have been working with him on this massive domestic priority. And for him to sort of say to them, yep, I hear you, some of that's in there, some of it isn't, and I'll campaign with you to make it happen someday in the near future. But if you can get members of those caucuses, again, Asian, Black, Latino, gay, and essentially women all in the House Democratic Caucus, you've got most of the House Democratic Caucus there in one way or another. And so I think at this point, what the White House and its legislative team is trying to do is single out who really are the holdouts and who can they nail down, even if certain things are not there. As I believe it was James Clyburn, the number 3 House Democrat, came out and said, look, we have unity, we don't necessarily have unanimity. And he, too, expressed the idea that the perfect not stand in the way of the good or something that they believe they're on the verge of passing. It's these kinds of meetings, shoring up the support for this bill, that the White House clearly wants to hold to signal that they're almost there with just a few key sticking points left. And again, women, really much of the nation's urban population, because that's who these people represent, and then those that are most economically distressed, and frankly, who would almost immediately stand to benefit from any implementation of a new government paid leave plan, paid family leave plan, designed to get them excited about this, starting to talk about it with their colleagues, with their constituents, in the press. We'll see, though, whether they're going to ultimately have the votes here in the coming days, if we're on the verge of some kind of a framework to be announced later today or tomorrow.
All right, Ed, on another topic, the president is again refusing to exert executive privilege over the documents former President Trump is trying to keep away from the special House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the Capitol. What is the reasoning here, and what happens next?
Bottom line, this White House has said all month in a series of letters to the National Archives that President Biden does not agree with President Trump that he can exert executive privilege over documents that are being sought by the special House committee investigating the attacks of January 6th, and that those documents need to be handed over to that panel for its review. The former president is suing now to block the distribution or the sharing of those documents from the archives with Congress, and it could be that he amends the lawsuit or files a new one based on the letter that was sent yesterday. But the White House General Counsel instructed the archives to hand over the documents in the coming weeks, once again signaling that when it comes to January 6th and most of the documents that Congress is requesting, they should be handed over, and the former president no longer enjoys executive privilege.
Sarah, on the January 6th committee, what can you tell us about potential cooperation from other subpoenaed witnesses?
Well, obviously, we are seeing a lot of resistance from Trump aides to cooperating with this inquiry, which many of them don't even see as legitimate. I mean, recall that there was just a broad effort at the formation of the committee to not have any Republican participation at all. And if you talk to a lot of Republicans, they'll really discount the participation of the two Republicans that do happen to be on the committee. And the same goes for a lot of the witnesses. They don't want to participate. There's obviously going to be a lot of resistance from the Trump side to sharing documents. And it's not just unique to January 6th. That was the case with all kinds of investigations, with Congress trying to exercise its oversight authority during the Trump administration. That was the case when it came to the president's taxes, for example, the former president's taxes, and any number of other issues. So it's not surprising that they are taking that approach here, especially because fundamentally both sides see what happened on January 6th as such different events with such different causes. It's really not surprising to see the Trump side try to delegitimize this exercise of oversight authority from Congress.
All right, well, let's turn to the Virginia governor's contest. Philip, you wrote about a new ad from Republican Virginia gubernatorial candidate Glenn Youngkin. Here's some of that.
They passed bills requiring schools to notify parents when explicit content was assigned. It was bipartisan. It gave parents a say, the option to choose an alternative for my children. I was so grateful. But then Governor Terry McAuliffe vetoed it twice. He doesn't think parents should have a say.
So, Philip, what is the story behind that ad, and how has parents' choice in education become such a lightning rod in this race?
Yeah, it's sort of fascinating that ad actually ties into something that happened back in 2013. Actually, the legislation, I believe, was vetoed in 2016. But that it's very, very in tune with the conversations been happening nationally around race and education. So the exact scenario that is described in that ad, the parent's name, I believe, is Laura Murphy. So she her son came home, and he'd brought a reading assignment that he had. Her son was a teenager, 17 or 18 years old. He was in an advanced placement English class, and they'd been assigned to read Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about a woman who was enslaved and who murders her child, her infant child, because she doesn't want her child to grow up as a slave. And it's, the story of, the child's ghost comes back, and it's very, very gripping. It's very emotional. There are absolutely some parts of the novel that are, not something I would have a young teenager read, but it's the sort of thing that obviously is part of the national conversation, particularly, when we're talking about things like race and slavery. So that's the book. That's the situation. She objected to that being part of the curriculum. The law was passed by the Virginia legislature. The Virginia legislature at the time was more conservative than it is now because Virginia's moved to the left, and McAuliffe vetoed the legislation. Essentially what it would do is if there was an item that was going to be used as part of a curriculum, parents could say, hey, I object to that, and then the teacher would have to come up with some other sort of thing to include in that. And of course, that fits very neatly into this subject of conversation that's been roiling all year, that's really been promoted in large part by right-wing media, that focuses on this idea that there is an effort to teach race in an unacceptable way in schools. You know, talking about things like critical race theory and using that term to describe a whole range of things that are related to race and education. And that Terry McAuliffe had vetoed this bill, I think, was probably just been manna from heaven for Youngkin's team. They put this ad together, and it really tries to piggyback onto McAuliffe's claim, as you heard in the ad, that he said that, you know, parents should not be telling schools what to teach, in essence, which I think very much, again, plays into this narrative. And Youngkin's lucky that he has this veto to sort of elevate at this moment in the race.
Yeah, and as we've heard from conversations that, Ed, I know you've had with voters out in Northern Virginia, clearly this issue is very much a hot button issue. Ed O'Keefe, Philip Bump, and Sarah Westwood, thank you all very much.